Welcome. We are very happy to welcome you today to the first event of our new series of online lectures and workshops, when museums meet video games, new horizons. And today, the first event is New Horizons, Video Games and Museum. I am Maxime Laprade, and I have been working on this program with an amazing team, including Diane Drubet, Emma Butin, Denis Connell, Laura Baud, among others. This program is presented by the Cultural Services of the French Embassy via the Villa Albertine, a new cultural institution reinventing artist residencies across the United States. Denis Canel from the French Embassy will soon talk a little bit more about this to us. This program is also organized by We Are Museum, a community of museum changemakers leading museums to change. I invite you, if you don't know the online community of We Are Museums, to visit it online. And this program has been developed in cooperation with the Smithsonian, which contributed to build a rich program by giving thoughts and precious insights into the topics that we will cover together. So right now, I'm going to give the mic to Denis Connell from the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the United States, who will talk to us a little bit more about the Villa Albertine.
Yeah, thanks, Maxime. So I am the cultural attaché at the French Embassy in DC. I'm very happy to be with you today for this first event, as Maxime said. So the program is an initiative of Villa Albertine, that is a new French institution for arts and ideas that has just been launched in the United States, with a permanent presence in 10 major US cities. It means to foster in-depth exploratory residencies for artists, thinkers, and cultural professionals from all creative disciplines. Villa Albertine will also actively support the endeavors of French cultural actors across the country, and will also offer professional programs that cover key cultural fields and creative industries. In DC, Villa Albertine will explore more specifically some of the most significant contemporary challenges faced by cultural institutions and especially museums in our societies when trying to reinvent themselves and to attract a broader and diversified audience. So thanks for being with us, and thanks to all our guests for sharing this, for being with us for this event. Thank you.
My name is María Luján. I'm a video games curator. I have been running the exhibition Game On, Arte and Juego for over 10 years now in Latin America. I'm co-founder of GAIA, an event that is meant for the game arts ecosystem that gathers curators, event organizers, producers, and community builders that think of video games as a cultural object. I'm also co-editor of the Journal of Game Studies at Universidad de Palermo in Argentina. Today, I have the honor of being your host at this opening session, where we'll be hearing from Brad MacDonald, Director of Creative Media at the Smithsonian Arts Industries Building. Brad will introduce us into the world of video games. We will also hear from Olivier Mauco, Director at Gaming Society, and from Augustin Pagenot, Deputy Head of Cultural Outreach at Centre Pompidou. They will both talk about the story behind Prisma Set and why the Pompidou decided to commission a game. But before we start, let me just share a short introduction on the theme that gathers us today. As we all know, video games and art have a long history together that can be traced back to the early 90s and the time that was the birth of the new media art. Back then, video games started its way into the museums under different shapes and ways and discourses, depending on the curator in charge and the institution that welcomed them. And actually, the Pompidou was one of the first centers that organized a workshop on machinima curated by Isabelle Arbers, who I strongly suggest you to look for if you haven't still heard of her. Then we had a last decade filled with events and exhibitions of video games inside museums and art galleries that care about how video games can be a work of art. And the Smithsonian was one of the pioneers with the Art of Video Games exhibitions in 2012, which was a huge blockbuster and a press coverage a lot. But the thing that we will be discussing today is a new movement that is gaining attention now, and it's museums creating video games themselves into a way of reaching new audiences, to expand the exhibitions once that they are finished, once that the the doors of the museums are closed, as a way to engage, to interact, to think of new ways of education and reaching new people. But the thing is that there are tons of video games being produced right now. So how can those video games made by the museums stand out? For that, we need to get into the specificities of video games, into the new ways, that new shapes that they can take, and we need to understand what are the needs of the museum, what are their challenges, what do they want and what do they need, and how can these two worlds complement each other into a better experience for the audience. So, without further ado, let me just introduce you to Brad MacDonald, an interaction designer, artist, musician, and storyteller. Brad is the Director of Creative Media at the Smithsonian Arts and Industries Building. He's consulted with the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History on the use of media and technology. He has taught several workshops on iterative design over the world, and he's currently teaching at Parsons School of Design in the Design and Technology program. He was also part of Large Animal Games and has been the lead artist and art director for over 100 mobile, online, social, PC downloadable games. Just remember that you can write down any question you have online, and we'll have some time after the panel to share that. Brad, this is all yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Calling in from my hotel in DC while we install an exhibit. I'll go to my slides. So, not knowing everyone who's attending, their various backgrounds and their relationship to games, I thought we'd start this off with a kind of a setting a framework for how we might think about games. First of all, they're complicated, and our concept of what games can be is constantly evolving. From the days of arcade cabinet games to now Pokemon Go, art-related games that mix analog and digital experiences. The field is constantly growing, and our understanding of how it operates is growing alongside that. So this talk isn't really about creating the final word on what a game is or defining a game, because as you'll see, even the experts in games are debating endlessly what games are. This is a 10-minute framework to discuss games and establish vocabulary that might be useful throughout the rest of the series and in our workshops. First of all, defining game is a bit of an impossible task. Even game designers and game theorists debate endlessly exactly what a game is. This isn't a comprehensive list of definitions of games, but it's just a sampling of sort of the array of different kinds of definitions and interpretations game designers and theorists have around games. They include everything from sort of like high-level theory to poetic translations of what games are to more functional definitions. And from this array, I've kind of winnowed it down to some quotes or descriptions of what games are, to a list that's a smaller subset. And from that subset, I've selected Jane McGonigal's quote, "When you strip away the genre differences and the technological complexities, all games share 4 defining traits: a goal, rules, a feedback system, and voluntary participation." Those of you who are in the games industry are very close to it, game theory. We could probably spend an entire week over drinks and food and not get any sleep debating whether this is actually a comprehensive definition of games. But for our purposes, I think it's functional and facilitates some deeper conversation. Simply put, video games are electronic games played on a video screen. Top left, you have an Atari 2600, various things, AR, VR, PC, mobile-based games, the Switch, and even in the kind of bottom near right corner, you know, the games like Pokemon Go and kind of mixed reality games are blurring the line of what is in a video game because it's played through a digital medium like a mobile phone, but they're experienced in the real world, and it is analog. And so there's a blurring of lines. There aren't just analog games and then video games. There is a space where they both coexist. There are a lot of theories and explanations about sort of how games operate functionally. The one that I thought is a good point of entry to the conversation that I would start with is the MDA framework. It breaks down games into 3 central components: mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. And I thought this might be useful for those of you who are engaging with game developers or contractors or participating in our workshops. I encourage you to think through this framework as it applies to the work you're doing. In short, mechanics are the rules designed for the player to interact with. They're the rules, the actions the player can take, and then the underlying structures, the algorithm and the code that define how those rules operate in the system. The things I have selected here, the mechanics are pretty clear. In the top left, it's a matching colors, typically thought of as like a match 3 game. Then there's Scrabble. I build words to accumulate points. In the bottom left, Subway Surfers. It's an endless runner game. I am endlessly moving forward and trying to avoid obstacles while collecting things. And then Pac-Man, kind of like the endless runner, I'm avoiding obstacles to collect things and continue advancing from level to level. In these examples, the rules or the mechanics are pretty visually apparent. But as games kind of expand in scope, the mechanics can overlap with one another, creating kind of deeper and richer systems. And even these here are combinations of different mechanics that work with one another. You might hear people talk about dynamics or gameplay, particularly if you're working with game designers or game developers. They'll just kind of use gameplay as kind of this catch-all descriptor. And really what it is, it's a relationship between the goals, mechanics, and player decisions. And I would throw into that the narrative theme. So it is, once the rules have been established, what does the player then do in that space? And I've made a note at the bottom there that very often when we talk about emergent gameplay, which are like play patterns that evolve from within the system, but aren't necessarily by design. It's just that developers have created the space for players to come up with solutions on their own, to explore in new ways that might be surprising to the developer even. So dynamics is the gameplay. It's kind of the overlay of all the elements of the game together to create an overall impression. And then finally, aesthetics. Aesthetics as a term is more than visuals. It's the emotional response. And in a way, it includes kind of all these kind of sensory components with goals. Running through these really quickly, sensation, sort of like more sort of a sensory experience, gained as sense pleasure. Maybe tied to this would be kind of the richness of feedback that the game system provides to the player. Are they doing well? Are they not doing well? Fantasy, our ability to maybe kind of like empathy games might fit within the fantasy realm, being able to act out the roles of people who are other than ourselves. Narrative games of storytelling, challenges, obstacle courses, maybe like Subway Surfer or Pac-Man even. I think it's worth noting that challenges kind of make games replayable, because a core component of many games, when you break down sort of the qualities the games possess, is the mastery, the ability to replay and improve over time. A lot of games are about fellowship, creating companions, a social network, a framework for that. A lot of massively multiplayer games are within the world of fellowship. Discovery is exploration, which seems uniquely suited to museums. And then expression, who I am. How do I express who I am and what is important to me? And it's also worth noting that many games are an overlap of all few of these different kinds of aesthetics. And also that this list isn't comprehensive. There are many other kinds of aesthetics, but I thought this is kind of a nice subset to start the conversation. And then I want to kind of get into a little bit of technology considerations and museum considerations around games, just to give us some sort of like functional vocabulary again as we continue this conversation. The platform selection has an enormous impact on the type of game you might make. Is it mobile? Is it web? Is it PCR, virtual reality, augmented reality? All of these are good at certain kinds of experiences, and developing a fluency in terms of understanding of what these platforms mean in terms of the kinds of games you might make is sort of critical towards the consideration of developing games. Portability. Video games can be eminently portable. And so as a cultural institution or a museum, are you planning to leverage that portability for games, for maybe DIY or traveling or partner initiatives? Technology might that might play a part if you're a game that's done in HTML5. Could be a browser-based game and is really, really very portable. Or if you're developing a game in Unity, you might export it to a platform, WebGL, which is a format that is, again, also browser-based and playable online, which means the game can appear in many different locations. It doesn't need to be an application you install on a dedicated machine. Thinking about technology. Are you considering audio, on-screen captions, screen readers, adaptive controls for people with limited mobility? Usually it's good to think about these things early on in the process when you're developing, because that can actually have a significant impact on how your game is made. Continuing with technology considerations, the process. If you haven't worked with game developers before, it is often an iterative development process, meaning you're prototyping as you go, learning about the system and what is fun and what the learning outcomes are and how they surface through the active nature of prototyping. So embracing that and knowing maybe milestones aren't just built around arbitrary dates for payment, but things that you need to prove. Is it fun? Are players learning? Can players complete the experience? So embracing the iterative development. Managing scope and expectations. Games can inflate quickly. They become very big and complicated. So reminding yourself that if you're working on a game, you keep it compact and focused. Reminding the team what you're trying to accomplish, and anything that goes beyond that could likely be removed from the game in the interest of focusing the effort. Embracing paper prototyping. I think this is great for programming and education, and just sort of beginner or even just advanced game development teams. Developing paper prototypes allow you to better understand the rule systems that you're working with before you even get to the technology development. And then play games. There's nothing harder than trying to develop something that you don't engage with or don't understand. So if your team is considering games, you don't need to become a game player or a master of games, but familiarizing yourself with the field of games and what is out there. What games already exist that are similar to the kind of game you want to make. So it's kind of more museum-specific considerations. Being very clear about your learning outcomes. What do you want players to get from the experience? Find games that already exist that achieve something similar. And again, play those to see what they do well, what they don't do well. And then as a team, understanding what you're making. A true game, if you're talking to game designers, probably has things like competition, win-loss stakes, and things like that. Is that what you want? Or are you actually looking for something like an interactive that has the properties of games without being truly a game? Or maybe what you're looking for is an interactive learning model, something like an explainer that describes a fundamental principle of the exhibit you're working on. So being clear with your team about that, and also being clear with your developer. Because if you say we're making a game, your developer might have one picture in their mind, oh, a game is this, which might be very different than your own. So making sure everybody's on the same page early. Games are, as I mentioned earlier, very often about mastery. So developing games that embrace the idea of replayability. It doesn't need to be one and done, like a didactic approach to design, but maybe something more heuristic, where the players or your visitors are, by engaging with the game, they can improve. They can go through it multiple times and develop a sense of mastery, which is how we learn things, right? And then finally, museum considerations of time. What's your anticipated dwell time? A lot of times when I'm working on games for museums, it's like 3 to 5 minutes. And casual games and mobile games are kind of a great precedent for short session play. So if you're going for a shorter dwell time, maybe look at games that are like casual games and mobile games to build on sort of those sorts of models. Certainly, that's not the only way to make games, but for museums, there's certainly longer sessions are possible. But being clear about that, what is your dwell time? What is your expected dwell time? And how does replayability fit into that? Accessibility, again, very often games have consequences. They're competitive. And how does that relate to your institution's directives on collaboration accessibility? Are you okay with somebody being the winner or the loser? Or do you want everybody to win on a spectrum of winning? Or do you just not want competition to be a quality of your game at all? Again, being clear about that. And that often plays into accessibility in terms of if somebody has vision impairment and they're playing with or against somebody else, is there parity in their experience? And how do you create a sense of fairness there? So thinking through, again, accessibility. I've mentioned it a couple times because it's pretty essential. And then learning, games aren't didactic. They're not just about explaining something that's in a sort of one-to-one relationship. So I'd encourage you, if you think about games, let your players explore. Let them fail, but let them fail gracefully. Let them know if there is a fail state in your game, how could they do better next time? So you can improve their chances over the longer haul and have a better experience overall. And what are their measures for success? And how are you communicating success to your player? And yeah, and I think that is my introduction to games. It's a super brief introduction, but I hope it's useful. And I'd love to see maybe some of this vocabulary and these frameworks show up in workshops and other talks. And thank you very much. And it's exciting to be here.
Thanks, Rab. Definitely a lot to talk about. Now, let's hear from Olivier Mauco, PhD, researcher and lecturer in video games and science for Paris. Olivier is also director at Gaming Society, the company which created Prism-Set. Augustin Pagenot is the deputy head of cultural outreach at Centre Pompidou. Augustin leads cultural outreach programs, coordinates workshops and visit offers, and promotes creative events at the Centre Pompidou. He holds degree in art history and project management. Let me just remind you that you can share all thoughts and questions in the chat, and we will later come back to them.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. We're going to talk about the video game Prism-Set, first video game of the Centre Pompidou. It was launched on April 24th, 2020, and co-conceived with Gaming Society, among which Olivier, here to talk about it with me, as well as Bright. It was in partnership with IRCAM Amplify that created the sound design for the game. It's important to mention that it was co-financed with the help of the French Ministry of National Education, Youth and Sports. And needless to say, it was the first in the world of French museums to bring forth a video game. So, why did we go on about this? We wanted to open a new conversation about art and about museums, and specifically the Centre Pompidou. We aimed at reaching new and often outlying audiences, mainly teenagers from 12 to 16. We were trying to keep innovating in our field through our philosophy, and finally, trying to bring closer gaming and museum visiting. Like we saw before, that are much more related than we might think or construe. We launched right in the middle of a national lockdown, and it meant that part of the collection was accessible from afar thanks to the video game at a time when the Centre Pompidou was absolutely inaccessible to everyone. Now let's give you a glimpse of the experience, I hope with sound. Beautiful. In a few figures, what are we talking about? It's a 7-level games that last around an hour and a half if you go through the game without reading all the additional content. It's available in 4 languages, among them Spanish, English, and simplified Chinese. Those 2 last languages being very important for us for reasons I'll mention at the end of the presentation. We mentioned the rating not out of self-adoration, but because it is a very niche project of a very unique nature, and it had a strong meaning for us that it met a favorable response. At the core of the game were 2 key elements for us. The first one was to bring forth our cultural outreach philosophy of learning by doing. At the Centre Pompidou, youth can explore art through varied lenses that make them an actor rather than the subject of museum visits. Prismaset is very much an active medium to get into the collection through a video game. The second aspect was our conviction that Prismaset had to be a game, not an educational game, not a serious game, but a fun and immersive platformer adventure. Educational tools and contents are opportunities that you come across through the game as an additional benefit, but not the leading element. This whole experience was made possible thanks to a co-construction, and as such, I let Olivier present you the core mechanics of the game.
Thank you, Augustin. So, we wanted to create a game inspired by the artwork of the Centre Pompidou collection, where each level is a kind of interpretation of main themes. So how do we did that? It was quite simple, not easy, but simple because the collaboration were very easy. So we created a list. Centre Pompidou created a list of the artworks they wanted to put into the game, and then regroup them into 7 themes, like you can see: color and function, current systems. It was a way to question how color can be used. It is not just to put some color in an artwork, it could convey something else. So we had this pantheon of artworks, and we tried to create a kind of homage through each level. The 7th level has really an aesthetic interpretation of the themes. And this is very interesting because it's our first way to show how games can be a remediation of other medium and artworks. Then secondly, we work on the second part, which is the gameplay. The gameplay is here the medium. I think it's a kind of tagline, but it's very important to put it to underline it, because we really wanted to show our interaction, rules, objectives, feedback, as Brad developed before, are very, very important to develop a real playful experience. And first, we were really questioning who are we going to play, and we wanted to erase the idea of avatar. People was not very interesting. We wanted to do something more fluid, just like an abstraction to lower the barrier between the game and the player. And secondly, we wanted to develop some game mechanics for each theme. For example, on color and activism, we really designed this big abstract city, which can appear as a big system where there is some people we don't know who they are working, and these underlying people are just part of this big system. So the player interacts with the city, plus the blocks, and then the people in order to win for itself. So there is a kind of political discourse, of course. We work on light and physics. It was another way to explain how light is really material, and we created this gameplay feature where you can transform your shadow into a bridge, a light bridge, and you can work on it to reach new platforms. So these two examples gave us an idea on how you can reinterpret and create some experience that strengthens the idea that you learn by doing. Then we had also a communication strategy, very interesting, because we went into the Paris Games Week. The Paris Games Week, which is one of the biggest events in Europe and in France. You've got thousands of people, young audiences coming into this super great event. And we had this stand from the Centre Pompidou where you could play Prism-Set. And Prism-Set was discovered by gamers, like, oh, there is a Centre Pompidou, what is it? So they went into the play and they started to play. And through this opportunity, we create a link between the institution and the public and say, okay, if they do games, maybe it's for me. And it's very interesting because thanks to that, we start a conversation with gamers. We use, for example, website like jeuxvideo.com, which is one of the biggest websites. And we create this bond and this opportunity to connect through the games, through the event with these audiences.
And I believe that was the most important part for us, is that the Centre Pompidou is indeed, well, hosts a museum, but is an art center, and it's open creativity and as such open to everyone. So building on the game, we followed through new endeavors, like, for example, lately the Chill and Game Jam, which was an online event in March and April 2021 to promote gaming and creativity. It led participants to pitch game ideas, create game models, and present them to a jury of professionals without competition and without crunching. Those were very important moments for us. And beyond the game, they are it's a multifaceted array of uses. The first one was of an educational nature. As we said before, Prism-Set is backed with layers of educational resources within the game that are collected throughout the levels. So we shared classroom-ready content on 2 educational platforms that you obviously all know, and offered classroom workshop proposition and educational sheets talking about the various artworks presented within the game. Second idea was to create an arcade machine of a new format. We created an itinerary station designed by Shemseddine Erich to make the game available to volunteering educational centers further away from the Centre Pompidou, and perhaps to people that either didn't hear about the game or don't own a smartphone. The game could also be showcased soon in other Centre Pompidou projects, like the Centre Pompidou Malaga in Spain, or the Centre Pompidou West Bund in China, Shanghai. And I believe what we saw as well in terms of downloads was that we have a very wide array of users from parts of the world that don't access usually Centre Pompidou, from Brazil to China, meaning that the main purpose of the video game, to be accessible from afar, works quite well. So what about now? The game is launched, and it's strengthened for us new targets and new opportunities. From a museum perspective, I believe infusing gaming and gamification elements like role-playing, challenges, cooperation is a very interesting opportunity. Second one is presenting artists using new media. The Centre Pompidou is rich of collections from artists using a wide array of new technology at that time. And in the Studio 1316, we present contemporary artists using screens, projections, AR and VR. And I believe it's a line that we need to address. And finally, we saw that game were played from as far as Brazil and China, that game, Prism-Set. And to me, it's an incredible opportunity to be available from afar and in a completely new form. Not a pure restitution of what can be construed as a Centre Pompidou experience, but rather an interpretation of a visit through the lens of a video game.
Thank you. Through the lens of a video game agency, we wanted to consider the game as a social space, maybe to design more playful experience and spaces where you can meet, where people could spend time, maybe hanging on cultural topics or artistic activities. Maybe it's a prelude or a road to metaverse. Everybody talks about that, but there is this social dimension of gaming, which is very interesting, and a visit to the social events also. About the content, there is a large area. Is it little games on site, or is it long format game away the museum? We can adapt the content and the strategy to audience, and it's open really the possibility to create games, and this is very interesting and new challenging to reach new audience through new gameplays. And finally, the last question, let's talk about business, of course, and how can we reach a kind of balanced business model to develop more sustainable games and to be able to, I don't know, invent business model, because this is a new creative industry meeting museums, so maybe it could be paid game, freemium, premium, NFT. There is a lot of possibility, and the game industry can also help, I think, the museum world to imagine new way to create this sustainable model. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Olivier and Augustin. We have some questions for the audience. And 10 minutes, so let's get the conversation started. Now, the first one was, did Flower and Journey play any part in the ideation of Prisma Set?
I can answer. Yes, totally. For one main reason, not because we love that and they are super game, but because accessibility, we wanted to lower the game skills, meaning that everybody can play it. It should be very natural to play it first. And we didn't want to make a game that is based on very hardcore gamer skills, but very more on contemplative mind, reflection, and puzzle stuff like that. So that's why Journey, like the flow you've got on the trail, is of course a clear and bright reference to this.
Right. I will add, what were other inspirations and reference that got you into Prisma 7 from games and also thinking outside games?
Oh wow, there's a lot of references. First, the artworks. The truth is that we went to the museum, we had a visit with the guide. We told us, okay, you can go to the Miro, this is this, the Kandinsky is like that, the Picasso painting about memory, there is no color. And we say, oh my God, that should be a very super game to splash a color, to remember, and then discover the way and the path. And the artwork were the real inspiration.
I believe, going forth, and I absolutely agree. The building itself is a great source of inspiration because it was designed by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers as a sort of a huge toy box. And there's this logic of fluxes and movement within the structure that was very important for the design.
Right. Thank you. Another question from the audience regarding the making of the game. They ask, how long did it take to make it? The design, the development, when the idea started?
Cradle to launch, I would say early 2019 to launch in April 2020. So roughly a year and a quarter.
Yes, what took a long time was to first define the list, define the gameplay, the content, and we play test it at the Paris Games Week. We make this first level, and it's really important to see, okay, are we really out or are we touching something with the gamer? So it takes time because it's a long game. It's not a very small production. It's a real game, so it takes time.
Yeah, though 1 year it's quite quick for the development of such a game.
Yeah, it's in between. It's quick and long. It depends, but there was a lot of things to do, and we meet a lot of playtests also. We playtested with people, with our audience, 4 or 5 sessions to be sure that everything was really understood. So that adds time to polish it. What we say in the industry is 1/3 is for pre-production, 1/3 for production, and 1/3 for post-production and the polish time.
Right, thank you. Now a question for Brad. Brad, do you have an example of a successful game between from a museum, from your experience, some game that maybe that you work on?
I'll give you 2 examples. One, something I did not work on, and one is something that I'm working on. One of my favorite museum games was produced by Blast Theory, and it's at the Red Cross Museum in Geneva. And it's a Hurricane, I believe is the name of the game. And it's basically a large table in the round, digital table in which people need to prepare an island for a incoming hurricane. It's a great example of a social game. Players are in the round. It's very physical. You end up kind of like tapping things. It's not about perfection, but it's more about the shared experience to solve a problem. That's one of my favorite museum games that I've played in recent years. And then in terms of games that I've worked on, it's a little unfair, but I'm going to mention one that I've been working on right now, which will be launching November 20th here in Washington, D.C. as part of the Futures exhibition at the Arts and Industries building. There are a couple projects there that I'm really excited about, one of which I'm allowed to talk to at this point. But it's a collaboration with Autodesk, the software developer. And it is a game in which 3 players collaborate with an AI to design a more sustainable, equitable community. In some ways, it's a bit of a sim game. But really what you're doing is you're engaging with multiple players, talking to one another about their unique sets of needs. And there's an intervention by a governing AI, which makes suggestions on how to balance complex needs within an urban planning setting. And it's on that fine line. Like purists, game designers, maybe like that's not a game, it's an interactive. But we definitely leveraged things like a lot of game mechanics show up. We're very aware of the game space and try to make it feel as game-like as possible. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Now, for everyone, any surprises from the audience after playing the game? Things that you didn't expect and you say, okay, this is great, or not so great and we have to learn from this?
Yes, a lot of.
Who wants to start?
Yeah, maybe from the player's perspective, because it was interesting because some players, there is this link to modern and contemporary art, and they were like that, oh my God, if I don't understand, it is because I'm stupid, and they say I'm stupid. Gamer community is very particular, let's say, and it was interesting to see, okay, the professional people were very super happy to have a game made by Centre Pompidou first, so the professional community in France. Secondly, the jeuxvideo.com and everybody, magazines were very happy too, and players also. So we are quite surprised to have this positive review, because for decades, everybody that wanted to make games that were not from the games field were like, oh my God, that's not good. And also we had the non-gamer and the Pompidou fan that plays the game and saying, oh my God, a game can be cool. And it was maybe the first game they played in their life. It was so, I think, better than anything.
Yeah, I have to say, to me, the best reaction was from teachers that we to whom we showcased the game as an educational tool. And that found, in a way, the game itself very interesting and pleasurable, and wanted to go through the adventure to see each levels. And that really was the better part for me, was that people that didn't think video games were up to their alley found it quite enticing.
I'd like to build on that a little quickly. There's, I think the audience for games is well beyond the people who identify as gamers. And I think particularly within the museum and the cultural institution setting, you find you're engaging with people who don't think of themselves as gamers through games, the vehicle of games, and it kind of expands that audience. And I would, adding on that, one of the things I've always kind of find surprising is how many conversations games in museums can start outside of the institution, with other branches of the corporate world, through education. I think that a lot of people with specialized interests are very keen to see how games show up in other settings that are kind of like, I'll call them non-traditional settings for games. But it allows you to have conversations with a pretty broad audience in that regard.
Right, Ram. Yeah, that summarizes about everything. Now, just two more questions with really short answers before we get into the workshop and start to work. Brad, they are asking for tools that you think might help bridge the museum developer gap. Any ideas? They are mentioning mood boards, incredible tool for communicating the feel of the game. Anything that comes up now into your mind?
I think mood boards are great. I think thinking about mood boards are fantastic, I think, for sort of like the aesthetics, the creative direction, the art direction of a game, establishing tone and personality. I think there are other ways to find precedents for games. I tend to think like, I want a game of X duration, and I'll look at games that are about that length and find games that kind of play well, and that helps me manage sort of scope. But then I'll also say, well, here's an investigation of games that already exist that have a similar theme or mechanics that interest me. And then I'll have another kind of silo or bucket of references of things like the mood board. And all of these precedents can kind of serve different functions. You know, figuring out how much money you want to spend on a game. Here are games that are about that within your budget range. Here are games that were made within a certain time range. So I think that you can find precedents that kind of sort of target different needs and aspects of game development. I would also say playing games. You know, playing games with maybe your developer or your team to develop the facility to describe what works and doesn't work.
Fantastic, thank you. The last one, and that is for Olivier. They asking how big was the development team for Prisma Set?
So we had, as I quote the people, it's really short. We had Abdel and I and co-direction, Ahmed Majoubi, which was the game designer. We've had in 3D art, Jed Dalul, the artistic director, and we had also, let's say, our producer, Simon Bachelier, and manage the whole everyday life. And we had friends helping us on 3D, like Nicolas and Boris. So we were, let's say 8, I think. And oh no, I'm just forgetting my developer, Gabriel, sorry. Because without game dev, it's not possible. So that was the whole team.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I think we're right on time. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. This was a really eye-opening first session of the cycle. Thanks, Brad, Olivier, Augustin, for sharing your experiences. And thank you, the organizers, Villa Albertine, the Ambassade de France of the Techniques, in partnership with We Are Museums at the Smithsonian Institution. Thank you, all of you in the audience, for staying with us, for sharing your questions, and we hope you keep with us for the rest of the cycle.
Thank you very much, Maria, for hosting this event. Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Augustin. Thank you, Olivier, for the intervention and the wonderful exchange that we had at the end. We are coming to the conclusion of this first event of When Museums Meet Video Games. With the Villa Albertine, the cultural services of the French Embassy in the United States, We Are Museums, and the Smithsonian, I am thanking you for joining us today. We have our second event on the 18th of November, called When Cultural Institutions Become Video Game Producers. Don't miss it. We will see you again on that date. And for all the people on Zoom who are joining us for the workshop, I'll see you just now. See you next time, everybody.